Welcome to the World Economic Forum and a special debate on France 24. I'm Kate Moody. Europe is facing a dual energy crisis. On the one hand, since Russia invaded Ukraine in February, it's been scrambling to end its dependence on Russian oil and gas, seek new alternative energy suppliers, all while keeping the lights and heating on for households and businesses. On the other hand, the EU's goal of reaching carbon neutrality by 2050 underscores the need to switch to clean, sustainable energy sources. But that transition cannot happen overnight. It requires innovation, investment, and political leadership. Throughout it all, European businesses must remain competitive in the context of global instability and high inflation. So, how to balance these sometimes competing agendas? How can we square Europe's energy circle? To discuss, I'm joined by a distinguished panel from both the public and private sectors. Welcome, panel. Kadri Simpson, you are the EU Energy Commissioner. Thank you for being with us. Anders Opedal, CEO of Equinor. Laurence Boone, Minister of State for European Affairs for France. And Mads Nipper from Ørsted. Sorry about that. Welcome to you all. Commissioner, I'd like to start with a question for you, please. Over the last 12 months, we've seen Europe's energy situation change dramatically. Where do we stand today in terms of both energy security and sustainability?
Actually, we faced some anxiety already in the autumn 2021. And already in the autumn 2021, we started to reach out to our trusted international partners so that they were able to increase their supplies to Europe. And by now, we are in the situation where our gas price is down to the levels that we didn't saw in 2022. So pre-war price level is now here. Our underground gas storage is full, 81%. And we have been able to maximize our LNG terminals capacity. So, for example, in December, we received record volumes of LNG from our trusted partners, and the utilization of regasification was almost 95%. This year, we know that several FSRUs are coming to the market. That allows us to bring even more LNG to Europe, but it doesn't mean that we will replace all the lost Russian volumes with alternative suppliers. No, we have cut our gas consumption significantly already, 20%. EU 27 has cut gas compared to the previous 5-year term. And we are accelerating green transition because only electrification and own production can give us some security. Stronger security aspect is now on table very prominently, but we have not forgot the importance of affordability. And of course, our decarbonization targets are now higher than they were a couple of years ago because the crisis is here not due to the fact that we have been green, but due to the fact that we have not been green enough yet.
Anders Opedal, there's a lot of pressure to speed up the transition to green energy sources. From the private sector point of view, how do you feel as the head of a company that has historically been reliant on oil and gas production? How has it affected your business?
First of all, I would like to say that I'm impressed how Europe has handled the crisis. First, I had a lot of focus on getting more energy to Europe. From a Norwegian perspective and Equinor perspective, we have tried to step up. Overnight, almost, we become the biggest supplier of gas to Europe. And that's a position we are very humble of. And both with the Norwegian government, other operators on the Norwegian continental shelf, and ourselves and all our employees, we have really worked hard to see how we can provide as much gas as possible to Europe. At the same time, in this crisis, I think Europe has been able to have a second thought in their head. They've been able to looking at, how do we also decarbonize for the future? And this has enabled more investments in renewables, and particularly we're seeing quite a lot of interest for working with governments and industries and heavy industries, particularly on decarbonization of the industries. And I see more and more interest of that. So I think Europe has stepped up and at the same time moved forward during the crisis in 2022.
Mads Dieper, Ørsted is consistently ranked as the most sustainable energy company in the world. It transformed its business over a decade. What lessons can other energy providers learn during this crisis? How can they follow that model and speed up their own transition?
Well, first and foremost, I would say that we cannot just assume that it will be as easy or similar to what it was during our main transformation, which has happened from over the past 10 years from an almost purely fossil fuel utility to now a 90+% renewable company. But I think what can be learned is that the transition can happen a lot faster than we think it can. And therefore, assuming that it has to take decades to make a transformation to green energy, I would challenge whether we are looking too much backwards and not thinking radical enough. And I think just we do all renewable technologies, but essentially our main business is offshore, which quite honestly only 10 years ago was considered a curiosity in the total energy mix. And now I think to use what also Commissioner Simpson said together with state leaders of the North Sea, now the North Sea can be the power plant of Europe. And this is a mindset change that happens in less than 10 years. So I think we should dare to be much more ambitious and to structurally and holistically remove the barriers that stand in our way. And we can discuss those more, but we can, if we want to, we can remove them faster than I believe at least most people think is doable.
Another strand in all this, of course, is competition. Minister Boone, the French government has been calling for a European response to the sweeping green subsidies in the United States. We've heard this week from Ursula von der Leyen outlining an EU clean tech industrial plan. Does this give European industry the tools that it needs to be competitive in this market?
So first, thanks for the invitation. And I would agree with most speakers that we have managed this winter much better than could be anticipated, but we're not out of the wood yet. We have another winter, and even if we're radical and fast in the transition, that will not happen for 2023, 2024. Rising energy prices plus the Inflation Reduction Act has widened the competitiveness gap between Europe and the US. And I'm not saying that to complain, but I think this is a waking up call to Europe that it needs to be a lot more radical and a lot more proactive in responding to this challenge. So what we are supporting, and Ursula von der Leyen's speech was really interesting, obviously, I think it's a three-pronged response. We need first a simplification shock. When you compare the European actions and processes with the Inflation Reduction Act, one striking difference is the speed. The Inflation Reduction Act is about tax credit. That happened in 2 to 3 months. The European processes is closer to 2 years. So radical simplification for state aid, and why not tax credit? The second shock, I think, is a strategic shock. We need to focus on those sectors that will be essential for the energy transition. That also includes technology. We were discussing this, essential to optimize the grid and to speed up in our response, and also health. I think we talk about Ukraine, we had COVID. We need to be more focused on health. But we need to focus on a few strategic sectors, which is a move away from sponsoring companies. And the third angle, which I think is also essential, is we need a European response. What the two crises have shown us is how intertwined our supply chains are. So it's not enough to increase state aid in one country if we don't do it for everyone. Otherwise, we will have disruption of supply chains, and we've gone through this. That has been terrible. So a real huge big bang with simplification, strategy, and European view.
So we'll talk a bit more about competition in just a minute, but I want to first focus on that idea of cooperation, because we've seen throughout this crisis the need for cooperation, not just between the public and private sectors, but among EU member states, and also even among companies that might otherwise be rivals in a similar situation.
I think true. I mean, one of the things we've learned as well, stop me if you disagree, is that We talk a lot about trusted partners, and for example, Norway and Denmark, but one of the key things we have to address in the short term, and we haven't done it yet at the European level, is we are changing the energy mix. We all have different energy mixes. But we have interconnection, and we have infrastructure, which were assessed and dated prior to COVID and the war in Ukraine. The big challenge for tomorrow is to ensure that we can have enough supply that can go through the whole of the European Union and beyond. We need to do this together with all the eastern and southern part of Europe, as well as the northern part of Europe. So coordination and cooperation are even more critical than what we have before. And if I may add something, we talk a lot about critical raw material. That's also something which will be fundamental to realize the transition and to ensure we have those supply chains and infrastructure that we need.
Yeah, and I can highlight many, many examples between companies, but also between different states and how that all intermix in something which is needed. I mean, Anders is Equinor, and we are working together in several areas as an example. But maybe even more profound, for example, the North Sea Energy Island, which is being proposed by Denmark, will be one where, because quite honestly, Denmark has so much coastline that we could probably produce 5 to 10 times as much offshore power as we'll ever need. Whereas the Netherlands and Belgium have a very small coastline. I think Belgium only has 64 kilometers of coastline or something like that, so undersupply. And therefore making an artificial island which could combine huge amounts of green power and maybe even hydrogen that can actually be dispatched across different countries that might balance the European perspective. And at the same time, the consortium that our company is in also has a Dutch company and a French company in that consortium. So both a collaboration between companies that are sometimes competing, sometimes collaborating, and then even more importantly, amplified by how we can make an even more European solution rather than thinking selfishly as countries.
Anders?
Yeah, I just also want to highlight the need for collaboration, but I also a slightly different angle to it. Because we are talking now about energy security and that security of supply and making sure that we have enough energy. But also after the incidents in the Baltic Sea where the pipeline was blown up, they're talking about the different types of security as well, physical security and protection of the infrastructure and the critical infrastructure. Normally, companies have been able to maintain and develop this infrastructure themselves, and we have been doing surveys just for integrity purposes. But now it's also about protecting the pipelines and the critical infrastructure, making sure that there are no sabotage and so on as well. And companies cannot do that alone. So we need a much broader collaboration between companies and governments and to protect this, and also to make sure that the right type of information flows, actually. So we are working much more closer to intelligence services now than we have done even before. We also see that we need military. NATO has been patrolling as well, and we are very grateful for that type of activity that NATO has been doing, because that keeps our employees safe.
I will also add a couple of thoughts about solidarity, because 2022 was a wonderful year of acts of solidarity. First of all of us were supporting Ukraine so that Ukraine one day can prevail and win this war. Globally, Europe witnessed a wonderful partnerships with countries who were able to help us at the moment when Russia started to manipulate with our gas market. The United States, Norway, Azerbaijan, even UK, all of them were able to increase their gas production and helped us in this regard to fill our underground gas storage, and that calmed down the market. I think that one of the best examples of solidarity, symbolic value, was in the summer when we signed a memorandum of understanding with Israel and Egypt, so that cooperation between Israel and Arab country can one day provide us also additional energy shipments. At EU level, the solidarity was important too, because there are some landlocked countries who were very dependent on Russian pipeline gas flows. they need support from their neighbors who do have access to LNG terminals, and not all the member states do have underground gas storage. So in the middle of the winter, when there would have been any disruption, that was agreed between governments that you will provide support to your neighbors so that houses can be heated and critical infrastructure will receive gas. And then in business level, maybe last summer there was some competition and outbidding, and that was the reason why we paid extraordinary high gas prices. Now European Commission will accommodate something that we have not tolerating at all. This is consortium of gas buyers. We will create this, this cartel of buyers. This is temporary, not something that will impact our belief into market economy, but necessary to be better prepared for next winter.
Maybe raising another example, but which one I think is really important in terms of what collaboration can mean. Because one of the things we're really grateful for as the renewables industry is how governments across Europe have really taken charge of saying significantly upping the targets for renewable energy, which is now not only needed for climate purposes, but for security of supply and essentially geopolitical security purposes, which is very clear. But that is a fantastic starting point. But we are looking at things that can only be solved if we collaborate as potential barriers. And one of them is, we are, as an example only, we are a developer. We built renewable assets at scale. We don't produce the equipment. And normally, when we wanted to make a profitable project that we would operate for 30 years, we would put a lot of pressure on the supply chain. So those who make the wind turbines, the cables, everything else we need to build. And that was sort of a traditional sort of supplier relationship where we're saying if we can't make it stack up, we would put pressure on them for lower prices. Right now, that supply chain is pretty much across the board losing money. But we are looking at a supply chain that needs to invest tens of billions of euro in scaling up capacity to meet that. So we can no longer think about somebody we want to pass on lower prices to, because then we'll do even worse financially. So we as a developer and we together between government, EU, and the industry need to take a much more structural approach to the industrial policy that is needed to have a scalable industry. That's another thing where we need to gear shift the level of collaboration.
And there are a lot of different kinds of technology that are emerging during this transition, different kinds of sustainable energy that might be suitable to different markets in particular. How is that cooperation happening between the public and private sectors, but also between the innovators who are actually creating this?
I can just give a few examples because we talk a lot about renewable energy, and that is needed at scale. But also a lot of heavy industry, they don't have the possibility to reduce the CO2 emission by electrification. So then we need hydrogen, then we need carbon capture and storage. And obviously, using natural gas or coal are at the moment cheaper than using hydrogen. So there needs to be a lot of collaboration between the industries, companies like Equinor and other steel companies in order to create the demand, and we can the supply. But then the infrastructure, how do we bring the hydrogen molecules from A to B? And if you look at the oil and gas industry in the past, a project was able to fund also the investment of the infrastructure. But there is no kind of new energy forms like hydrogen or carbon capture and storage that also can pay for the infrastructure. So this is where we definitely need the collaboration between governments and the industry to enable that. And to decarbonize the heavy industry in Europe will be important to keep the jobs in Europe.
Minister?
Yeah. Perhaps I can come back on a couple of things. First one is there is a lot of state and European support to innovation. There's no doubt about that, and I think we're going a lot faster than we had thought. Now, there are a couple of things here which I think are still impediment to develop and ensure security of supply, because we need to address some sort of incompatibility triangle. We want security of supply, we want energy transition, and we want low prices and competitiveness. So that's a difficult combination we need to address. And for this, I think we need to be realistic in the sense that we have focused a lot on demand when doing the decarbonization framework. But as we were just saying, if we look at supply, we will need enhanced infrastructure. Hydrogen and the molecules doesn't travel very well today. It will perhaps one day. Some people think it will, others no. I think that tells us one thing is we need to diversify across the range of energy sources. And within Europe, we should not fight about low carbon, nuclear, gas, or whatever, but be a lot more open to the initial energy mix and how we can step up cleaner energy and be very open-minded about this. And the third thing is, again, I think we need to plan for those infrastructure. Otherwise, we will switch the demand and we won't have the supply for the firms, for the people, and the competitiveness hit that we have will not be addressed and we will lose the job. So we need to look forward to these three things.
For us, this is important to set clear targets. Right now, we are at the final stage to renegotiate renewable targets for 2030 with our member states. And these ambitious targets will send very clear signals to investors. And on top of that, very correctly mentioned that if we will electrify our economy, then that puts clear pressure to our grids. We do have European funds to invest into grid connections, but there we have to keep in mind that always we should opt for most efficient solutions. This is also one of the reasons why we are supporting strongly the sea basin cooperation for offshore wind, because you can see significant savings if member states will be able to cooperate. And they have been doing so in North Sea. Baltic Sea also set a very ambitious plans, and we do have 2-3 more sea basins lagging behind, but with floating offshore, for sure they do have great potential to cover some of the production also in Black Sea or Atlantic Ocean. And for us, the innovation is a key, because this is a good suggestion from International Energy Agency that the technology that allows us to achieve 2030 targets is here. But to become climate neutral, there are lots of solutions that are not market ready yet. They need support from EU, and we have done so. There are significant investments coming from Horizon Europe or Innovation Fund, and in this regard, I think that Europe is not such a bad place for startups. We are hearing a lot of complaints in regard of US policies, but let's keep in mind that when we presented our Green Deal, then this was not only about climate ambition, this was also European growth strategy. When we presented on top of the long-term multi-annual financial framework also the recovery plan, then this dedicated a significant amount of these additional financing that was made available to climate and energy-related expenditure. So we have done also several necessary steps from our side already. And as you heard yesterday, President von der Leyen announced next steps.
Yeah, and I think if I combine what both the ministers in the first point you made and then also what you said, Commissioner, is I think that Europe's response to the Inflation Reduction Act, I think intelligently, and that's also what we're seeing, is to build and take inspiration from how do we stimulate something as forceful to really create transformational impact on the energy transformation. And I'm really happy that Europe's response was not to fight the Inflation Reduction Act, because we need something as simple, as forceful, and as consequential as that. Because as opposed to electricity, which by nature is a local or regional market, then as soon as we turn green electricity into molecules, so into hydrogen and liquid fuels, it's suddenly a global market. And therefore, if Europe fundamentally does not become competitive on that, all those investments, and we are talking hundreds of billions of euro, will go somewhere else. So I'm really happy, and hopefully we'll see that the consequentialness, if that's a word in English, of the European policy being something that makes those investments stay in Europe.
Anders, just briefly, and then Minister.
Yeah, I just want to build briefly on the Minister here, because there is something I think is really on the core of this discussion, and the energy trilemma. And to solve the energy trilemma, the core of this is really to make massive investments in energy. The situation we have now is also because of the war, but at the same time, the underlying fundamentals before the war was that too little was invested in energy, particularly in renewable energy. And to reach net zero in 2050, we actually need all technologies available. And it's so important that there's open competition for all technologies, making sure that the best technology wins, but we all need all of those to get to net zero.
Yeah, perhaps just to rebound on what both of you were saying, I think really the competitiveness answer, the competitiveness challenge in Europe needs to be answered with a European response, which actually increases our competitiveness and doesn't trigger a trade war, that's for sure. Now, I also think that we shouldn't be naive. You talked about massive investment. This will require public-private partnership. And I think we can do better in Europe with this. There's already been a lot, but it's very national. And I think we need more about to think more about the European institution, like the European Investment Bank, to actually go, I would say, bolder, really. And the third thing is also, I think Europe, we talked a lot about, we're no longer naive. And I think that is true in instruments as well. Since the beginning of this year, we have a non-subsidy instrument, which basically, if a company is located itself in regions where there are heavy subsidies, which goes against the World Trade rules, then we can trigger a survey, and we can actually respond to that by putting a tariff on what they're trying to sell to Europe. So I think that's a message to be heard by firms who would like to move somewhere else to sell back to Europe.
So I'd like to steer the conversation a bit more toward this idea of competition because of its proximity to Ukraine and its former dependence on Russian energy. Europe has been hit much more than other parts of the world by this energy crisis. On an international level, how does Europe stack up, not just in its green ambitions, but in the concrete steps that it's been taking to reach those?
Well, okay, I'll give it a try. We are from Norway, and most of our business is towards Europe. And we find a lot of opportunities actually in Europe as well, with Europe really stepping up, as I said in the beginning, both on solving the short-term crisis, but also looking at the long-term crisis. With the ambition from the EU to the EU Fit for 55, the investment level, and kind of the discussions between the governments, the Norwegian government, the EU, Norwegian government in Germany, Belgium, and so on, are talking about real concrete projects to move forward to ensure that both more energy can be provided and also more decarbonized energy. And I think the heart of competitiveness for Europe in the future will also be the supply of energy. So I think if Europe just continue with collaboration across the different regions and not competing within Europe, Europe's competitiveness can be okay.
Mads, then Minister Bund?
Yeah, I would say that probably a ruthlessly honest answer is that up until now, Europe has not been where we need to be. I mean, I'm a proud European and from Denmark. Last year, onshore Denmark put up 3 turbines, because of all kinds of different obstacles, too slow consenting and planning processes. Spain had a heavily undersubscribed auction where I think gigawatts were offered, and it turned out that only, I think, a double-digit megawatt were offered. So we don't have the traction we need to. I think we see all the signs, the signs that planning and consenting today takes longer to plan and consent a plot of seabed than it does to actually build a €5 billion asset. And I'm very happy with how the European Commission is saying this is now overriding societal priority. It's fundamentally changing. But also the supply chain bottlenecks, we need to address that and shift to a totally different gear. But the honest answer is, looking back, Europe is not where it needs to be. Looking forward, we have to systematically remove the barriers for acceleration.
I'd just like to hear the Commissioner's response to that, and Minister Boone, I'll be with you then.
I tried to be short, but well, I fully agree that last year showed that the impact of the Russian war against Ukraine was severe towards Europe, our households and companies, and not so visible across the globe. I even think that Russia opened two fronts. One is full-scale war against Ukraine, and another one is energy war against Europe. So we are fighting the same war shoulder by shoulder with Ukraine. And our response was to get rid of this dangerous dependence as soon as possible. We are halfway. We still receive some gas from Russia, but we can replace it with renewables. Last year was a relatively good year for solar, plus 40 gigawatts of new installed capacity. It was not so good for wind, plus 15, and significantly, well, our expectations are significantly higher. So what can we do? First bottleneck, permitting, takes too long. Now, member states even don't have to transpose this principle that renewables, they are specifically needed and they are granted overriding public interest. That should shorten the permitting. Then the next bottleneck, technology. From where will we get to those turbines, these solar panels that we will need? That means that we have to heavily invest into European domestic production too, because we don't want to end up that one dependency will be replaced to another. And thirdly, you have to connect those new installations with our grid. There we are ready to invest also public money, because this is really necessary. Without investments to our grids, without making them smarter, the challenge is just too big ahead of us.
Thanks. I think first we should not forget about the short term. We still have a difficult winter ahead of us, and we have an electricity market reform which will be proposed. So I think the first focus is to give visibility to firms about what will happen the next winter. And for this, we need to speed up this electricity market reform and make sure we can have a secure 2023-2024 winter. Then I think we need to take a step back and look at the business environment of which the EU offers. And I think we need to be a lot more business friendly, meaning simpler regulation, faster regulation, higher threshold when it becomes state aid and so on, but really simplify things. The German Chancellor talked about Zeitenwende, and I think this also applies to the way we do things. And the last thing I think where I agree we're good is to set future targets. And we're probably the most advanced region in terms of decarbonization. But we also need to put it in place and to help firms and people adjust to this ambitious target. That's the next step.
One final word, Anders, and then we're going to open up for questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. One element I just want to bring in, as I said, we need massive investments, and in the energy sector is kind of long-term thinking and long-term investments. And there has been a dilemma over the last year, actually, with windfall taxes. Obviously, governments need more money and redistribute wealth. At the same time, that creates uncertainty in the investment community, because investing now and then, maybe the taxes will be changed again. And so it's important for the competition level in Europe also to make sure that the regulatory framework and the economical framework stays stable over time.
Are there any questions from the audience here? We've got some microphones, I think, that can come around. Yes.
Hi, Robin Niblett with Chatham House. Commissioner Simpson, you mentioned at the beginning that one of the successes was of the last year was a 20% reduction in gas usage in particular. Now, I don't know the proportion, but a large proportion of that, of course, was companies, heavy energy-intensive companies, not using the energy, producing less. If that carries on to a second year, then it means less jobs, less competitiveness, etc. I'm trying to get a sense of the balance here on the panel between the value of subsidies, we've talked about that value, but also the value of border protections. I think Foreign Minister Boone talked about tariffs. The carbon border adjustment mechanism has been laid out. I'm wondering how that fits, because I could see in the end, if you're going to have to import a lot of products to be able to make the renewable energy transition, you're going to need a lot of stuff from abroad. And that will be potentially then hit with the carbon border tax or with a tariff. So I'm just trying to work out how we balance subsidies and tariffs to make this energy transition work.
I will start with savings because it was actually first ever occasion where the European Commission used this extraordinary article that we do have in our treaty, Article 122. In the middle of the summer, we saw that gas prices were hitting extraordinary highs. And we did our utmost to receive additional volumes of LNG, but at the same time, we had to calm down the market. And in the middle of July, we gathered our energy ministers, and within 5 days, we found agreement with all the 27 member states, agreement on gas savings. And yes, I do agree that a big part of our gas savings is due to the price signals. You are just not using gas. You will opt for any kind of fuel switch, which is delivering cheaper prices. Partially, we achieved 20% gas savings due to the mild weather. No one knows what the winter might look like, but already in October we were sure that we will get through this winter unless it will be extraordinarily cold. So it has not been the case. Now we know that we will end this heating season with half-full storage that helps us to be better prepared for next winter. And now on this subsidy and taxation issue, we used once again this Article 122 to allow our member states to collect some revenues to support small and medium enterprises and households, because this is necessary. The prices are 5 times higher than they were before the war. And at the same time, I do believe that companies, if they are, thinking about this situation that we saw in 2022, have to agree that nobody predicted it. So if you made your investment decisions, never ever you thought that we will hit a price level as high as it was. It was a war consequence. It was due to the fact that Russia manipulated with its gas flows, and due to the fact that Europe remained united and none of our leaders went to Moscow to negotiate, which is also a great achievement and a sign of solidarity.
But if I can build on saying how we ensure a sustainable transformation of the energy system, including sort of having a strong European industry, but also be very realistic about what is it where we will be dependent, because there's no doubt that the materials side of the green transformation is a massive challenge. I think an offshore wind turbine uses 9 times as much copper as the equivalent of a power plant, just to give an impression. And also rare earth materials, rare minerals, where other parts of the world have probably thought much more strategically about where could the world be headed. And I think therefore Europe cannot and should never be sort of isolistic, where we sort of saying we can do everything ourselves. We shouldn't be. But we need to be very realistic of what does it take to where we really will insist to have our strengths, to incentivize to build strength, whether that is in our own energy, in critical parts of the supply chain, but really try not to close our borders or tax so hard that we will eventually run into significant strategic challenges in not too many years. So staying open whilst being very mindful to have industrial policy of where we want to be strong.
Perhaps I can add to this. The first thing is there is a critical raw material act which is specifically designed to ensure that we will have these raw materials. And obviously, they're not all coming from Europe. I think everyone's aware of this. Well, the second thing I wanted to say is first, let's not forget that Europe, it's a continent with 500 million people, most of them in the EU. That gives you a market power, right? And we should not be shy as Europeans of this. Other regions are using this. The third thing I wanted to say is we have a long-term target of being the first or largest or whatever region decarbonized in the world. That means we need to put policy in place to achieve this. The price signal is essential. We're all in favor of a market economy. So that's where the carbon tax comes from. At the same time, you want subsidies to accelerate the development of innovative technology. That's not absurd either. It's really where we can go faster and simpler. And the last thing is I think you want to have people on your side when you do the energy transition. We're not going to do it against them. And that's the reason why we need to protect the most vulnerable consumers and firms in the transition. And there are two funds with the EU to do that, and that's super important. And as for investment, as I think we were all saying, it's about the business environment. But I think we shouldn't be shy of saying as well, there has been amazing profit. It was not sought for. Everyone would prefer to have no war, but they are there. They can be invested, and they can be used to protect the people too.
We can take one more brief question.
Hi, I'm Uwe Heuser, an editor of the German weekly Die Zeit. You talked a lot about European cooperation, but it's also obvious that there is a lot of a new competition between countries for renewable direct investment. For example, Sweden with its north, with all the hydrogen, with all the water power, Spain with the solar energy. They're trying to attract all kinds of direct investment also from other European countries. Green steel, green everything. So I wonder how you see this interplay between this new kind of competition between countries and the needed cooperation in creating a European energy supply.
We will just brief here, I'm afraid, sorry.
I can say two things very quickly. One of them is, again, it's infrastructure and interconnection. If you invest massively in some new renewable technology, you were mentioning the island in the north, the same with Norway, it's also to diffuse across the European Union. And the cooperation comes that at the beginning we need a level playing field and we need everyone to be able to invest in those. Then there's always been competition, which is why I was talking about supporting sectors, not firms. Competition is healthy, it creates innovation. But the security of supply concerns all of us, and if there's a failure in the supply chain somewhere in Europe, we will all be impacted. That's where we need cooperation. Short enough?
I think it is. I fully agree. It's actually very good that there's also some kind of competition, because, like the Commissioner said, now EU has created a playing field for consenting and planning periods to go down, but that has to be implemented nationally. And for those who implement it effectively, there will be more investments, because it will be easier, it will be faster, and I think that's a good incentive for everybody to be fast. Whereas if we all have to wait for the lowest common denominator, too little might happen. So I actually think, like was said, we need common European solutions for the energy transformation. But there's an element of who does it most effectively is, I think, healthy to get speed across Europe.
Just I can add, we also need a bit of common money for cross-border investment.
That is true, very true.
I'm reliably informed we have exactly 2 minutes left. I want to ask you each one closing question, because we've talked a lot about the role of the public and private sector, the companies, the governments. What about individuals? What about our viewers? What should they be doing in the energy crisis in this green transition?
They should think through how they consume energy. And this is a great year for renovation right now. So all across Europe, people and families, they do discover that if you are able, together with your neighbors, to renovate your homes, the savings will be there, and this is good for climate too.
I think the recent crisis in energy has demonstrated to everyone that energy actually has a cost, and we need to save as much as possible. And I think I see, when I was building around Europe, I need to take an extra jacket on myself. We have changed habits. Everyone, I think, installed heat pumps and turned down the temperature. And what we have learned during this crisis is something we need to bring with us also when the prices come down. Because if we're going to do the energy transition, we actually need to be very energy efficient.
Minister?
So, like everyone, I think reducing demand is the best way to reduce the pressure on prices, first thing, and all of us can contribute to this, obviously. The second thing is, I think, being very open in terms of energy diversification for the transition, because we will need all levers as much as possible.
fully subscribe to the energy efficiency argument because that's something everybody can do. But I would add to that, stay courage in the leadership to make the hard decisions. Because what we're doing short term is necessary, but much of it is wrong. So we burn more coal and oil, but make it short term so that we keep the long-term trajectory towards a net zero world by 2050.
That was very brief and efficient. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to all of you here at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And thank you to those of you watching at home on France 24. Stay tuned.